This is just the beginning.
Hi, and welcome to Axios' special news event. I'm Sarah Fisher, media reporter for Axios. And welcome to our audiences on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and on Axios.com. You can join the conversation by using the hashtag Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleague, Axios co-founder Mike Allen, as we explore the Facebook Oversight Board's decision around Donald Trump's indefinite suspension. Now, our first guest joins us, Vice President of the Cato Institute, John Samples. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
So let's get to the decision. Critics are saying that you sort of kicked the can on this. You pushed it back to Facebook instead of, having a hardline decision of bring him back or don't bring him back. Why weren't you more definite here? Like, what's the point of having a board if you're not going to make a clear-cut call?
Well, we thought above all this was not a decision about Donald Trump, but rather a decision about Facebook. Our role at Facebook is to act as an oversight board. That is, we look at how Facebook does its content moderation, how it enforces its rules, what it leaves up, what it takes down, and decide whether it's been done in a fair and just way. And in fact, in this case, we decided that in the original decision, Facebook had decided to enforce a law, a rule, that it didn't exist at the time. And so that's a fault with the process. And since Facebook itself is both rule maker and enforcer, it's their job to enforce the rules. And so in a sense, we were being tough with them. We were telling them that they have to enforce the rules, and we decide if they follow the process and if what they've done fits international norms on free expression.
But how are you going to hold them accountable? I mean, you asked Facebook in 6 months to sort of adjust its policies to meet your expectations of what you think is right. Do you have any power to actually hold them accountable?
Well, we made several policy forms of policy advice, things we think they should be doing that grew out of this case. However, there are two differences here. One is the decision itself is binding on Facebook about whether the indefinite suspension of Mr. Trump was correct or not. But our policy advice is simply something we give to them that we think is a good idea. Now, we can't force them to do it, but I think they have to look long and hard at these. That's part of the agreement. And then I think they will find that this is in Facebook's interest to begin to fill out its rules, really, and make it more law-like and more procedurally correct.
So if you don't like the rules, still, there's nothing you can do to address that?
I think it is possible that this case or other cases could make it to the board, and and it will involve an actual decision that would require us to vote up or down on and have a binding decision. So I would not say categorically that there's nothing we can do. Remember also the public sees the political advice. Part of the accountability, an important part, is Facebook's accountability to its users and to the more general public.
I saw Facebook responded to your decision within minutes of it coming out. Did you give them a heads up before you put this out publicly?
The board's independent of Facebook. I don't know that they were told about it in any respect. I simply don't know that, and I'd be very surprised if they were.
When it comes to the actual decision, you write that you needed a majority of the board to vote in favor of it. You also referenced that a minority within the board had different policy positions at certain times. What was the ratio between all the board members of those that supported the decision that went up yesterday versus those that did not?
It's general policy at the board not to reveal those numbers, and so I will not.
Well, when it comes to that minority position, I mean, we saw some places in your case where you address what their feelings are. For example, a minority of the board said that you should take into consideration President Trump's actions before the Capitol siege, not just what happened after. What were the biggest points of contention between the minority and the majority of the board?
I think if you look at, well, first of all, minority had its say in this decision. And I can tell you that in all of these cases, it really comes out to be a deliberation and a search for consensus. And at some point that consensus is not reached, minorities can have their own view. In this particular case, I think one issue was, what is the proper community standard? A minority thought that in addition to the community standard, that is the Facebook rule that's applied, which was so-called dangerous persons or organizations, that Mr. Trump had praised people involved in a riot, that in addition to that, the minority thought that Mr. Trump was guilty of incitement under Facebook rules. The majority did not, having made the decision and upheld the idea that praising people was not justified, and justified Facebook taking down the account, saw no need to go to the incitement question. That I think was a major issue. There were other issues about how broad the decision should be and matters like that.
When it comes to some of the policy recommendations that you made, and I assume, again, that the minority and the majority of the board had different perspectives on it, I just want to be clear about some of the things you're asking Facebook. One of the things that you suggest they do is come up with a completely independent group of people within the company that's going to make decisions like what happened with Donald Trump, totally independent of executives there, et cetera. So I just want to be clear. Are you suggesting that in the future, if a call needs to be made about something like Donald Trump or a state leader inciting violence, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Nick Clegg, those types of people should not be involved?
No, I don't think that's what we were implying. This is a good example of how public comments affected the board and its considerations. More than a few people in the public comments had called for specialized knowledge, specialized skills to be able to assess the context. Context is so important in these cases. To assess the context where world leaders were involved in using Facebook, perhaps abusing it, right? So we thought it was a good idea to recommend to them that they develop a specialized unit inside of Facebook and its content moderation team that would have either regional or nations or whatever, the kind of expertise to act quickly if need be on these issues. But this is more a development of capacity, research capacity, of knowledge, than it is a decision-making capacity.
I want to go back to what you were saying about the comments. I tried to read through as many of the 10,000 that I could. I actually didn't see a lot that were coming from users whose native language wasn't English. So how much of your weigh-in here came from global users and global people, or was it mostly that English-speaking people in North America were the ones that cared about this?
I don't know the breakdown of the 10,000 or almost 10,000 from inside the United States and abroad. And in terms of what was actually considered, I don't, we didn't keep any records on that. So I can't give you a definitive statement about that. I will say that I think public comments that had merit, that spoke to the issues we were debating, were considered fully, whether they were from the United States or from other countries.
Yeah, and to that point, obviously you're making this decision not just based off of comments. You're talking with each other, you're consulting outside experts. Like, how much does a public comment even really weigh on these types of decisions? Or are they mostly made amongst the board and a few experts?
Well, by the nature of the case, it's a deliberation among both, first a subset, a panel of the board, and ultimately the board itself. So yes, much of the talk is there. But again, I would emphasize that if people make public comments, and I should say also in other cases I've noticed where context matters, people bring knowledge of a context in a decision, it really is the merits of the comment. If you pay close attention to it, and it's a good comment, this is something we take very seriously.
One of the things you say in your recommendations is that Facebook has this concept called newsworthiness. They didn't use it in the Donald Trump case, but they use it sometimes to help determine whether or not they should pull something down or leave it up or ban someone or suspend someone, etc. But it sounds like the board thinks that the newsworthiness standard, it shouldn't apply when there's something that's really harmful that could happen. It kind of feels like you guys think that that's sort of a flimsy standard. Is that true? Do you think Facebook should just get rid of it altogether?
It's true in this case. They say that they had never used the newsworthy standard, so it's not a focus of the decision. However, on the policy advice side, we do talk about it. I don't think there's a sense of the board that it's a flimsy standard. What is said in the policy advisory is that it should never serve as a means for allowing speech that does imminent harm to people. In other words, these situations that can develop so quickly, and ones in which people are a speaker or someone exercising their freedom of expression, is causing imminent harm right here, right now. We're saying that Facebook should realize that that is not a good excuse for not stopping them. But also, I think there's a call in there for it to be more public and more transparent about exactly what newsworthiness means. In a lot of cases, I've noticed uncertainty about newsworthiness causes a fair amount of controversy in itself.
I guess to that point, you also make a distinction to say that, sometimes there shouldn't be such a big line between a political leader and someone who's an influential figure. But you do call out that there should be some sort of different standard for head of state. Can you walk me through those distinctions?
Well, I think there's a recognition in the decision that the same set of rules should apply to ordinary users and to leaders, political leaders in various ways. There should be no special exceptions for political leaders. There is the issue that there is a recognition that I think on both sides, political leaders are important, particularly in democracies, because they contribute to speech about policy, about politics. And they also reflect people's views. So they play an important positive role, but they can play they can threaten to do imminent harm. And in those cases, we hope few in number, that Facebook is justified in moving against them. But I think there was a strong sense that we don't want special exceptions for powerful people, that Facebook needs to be in a position where they can say no to the powerful also.
Well, speaking of exceptions, this is my final question for you. Typically, Facebook has 7 days to implement your recommendations, 30 days to publicly respond to them. But in this case, you said Facebook has 6 months to come up with new policies and decide what it's going to do. Why did you switch the response rate here for Facebook? And how did you come up with the date of 6 months from now?
So we expect within 7 days they will respond to the entire decision, including indicating when they will revisit this case and make a decision. We gave them 6 months, inevitably, because we thought this decision is complicated. There was a lot of policy advice they also need to take into consideration in that period, as well as get themselves together to make a decision. So there was inevitably, discussions about this, but ultimately a majority of the board felt this was a good term for that. And, we hope that in that period gives them time to work on and follow up on our policy advice, which we think should be valuable to them.
John, this has been so helpful. Thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me today. And now we have a segment with Axios co-founder Mike Allen.
I'm Mike Allen, a co-founder of Axios, coming to you from Axios HQ in Arlington, Virginia. Our final guest today is Helle Thorning-Schmidt, former Prime Minister of Denmark and a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Madam Prime Minister, welcome to Axios.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So you have diplomatic, business, philanthropic connections all over the world, and I know social justice has been very important to you through your whole career. Is it fair to say that with this decision, the board prioritized immediate harm over longer-term social issues like free speech?
No, I don't think it is. We are very much concerned with free speech. This is one of the reasons why I joined the Oversight Board from the beginning, and also as Prime Minister, I was fighting for free speech in my own country and everywhere else. So this is about that free speech is not absolute. There are things that can limit free speech. And for example, if there's a platform like Facebook and you incite harm and also does it in the moment, it is actually shows that that free speech is not absolute. There is a limit to that. You can't actually incite harm as Mr. Trump did. So I don't think this is choosing one thing above the other. Free speech is an extremely important right. It is one of the most important human rights that we have, but it is not absolute.
So you were concerned with what Mr. President Trump was inciting?
We were very concerned what he was saying. If you look at what he was posting those days, it was both "we love you" to the supporters, but it was also in a context where there was clearly some wrong. He suggested there was wrongdoing in the election, and we all know what was said those days. So we balanced it out and said that he was part of inciting the violence and was causing harm. And that's not because we're not interested in free speech. That's because we are passionate about free speech, but also recognize that, particularly if you are a leader with that kind of responsibility, you don't have complete free speech. There are things like inciting harm that can stop it.
In the previous conversation in this Axios event, my colleague Sarah Fisher was talking to one of your colleagues on the oversight board who said that you see this as a decision about Facebook, not about Donald Trump, but you knew how it would be viewed, seen, covered.
Yes, but we're trying to do two things. First of all, we are trying to look at the actual posts that were taken down by Facebook and when Mr. Trump was removed from the platforms. So that is one thing. But we're also trying to see this from the user's point of view. And what we're telling Facebook is that they can't invent penalties as they go along. They have to stick to their own rules. And that brings me to perhaps the most important thing here, which underlines that this is not so much about Mr. Trump, but rather more about Facebook and its users, because we will only get rid of this talk that Facebook is leaning towards certain political opinion if when we get to a stage where all decisions on Facebook and Instagram are taken with transparency and clarity, and where all users are judged by the same standard. And that is why we were adamant that Facebook couldn't just invent a new penalty for this particular user.
Madam Prime Minister, would you say the issue for Facebook is that they need additional rules, that their rules are inadequate, or do you just think they need to be more consistent?
They need more consistency. I don't think they need more rules. I think if you look at the community standards, combine that with their values, which they also put an emphasis on, and the human rights that they have promised that they want to abide by, then you have sufficient rules to take these decisions. What we want to get rid of is the lack of transparency and also this an arbitrary decision making. So this is why John Samples would be saying that this is perhaps more about how Facebook reacts and acts more than President Trump. It was very obvious to us that the posting was inciting harm or causing harm. What was also a surprise to us was that Facebook invented their own sanctions as they looked at this particular user.
Madam Prime Minister, if you will, set the scene for our audience. How long did you spend debating this, considering it? How contentious was it? What was the vote? Take us inside.
Yeah, as people might know now, we work with panels. So we have a panel of 5 that looks at the case first and asks the questions to Facebook. We asked 46 questions to Facebook and looks at the case. Then we had a number of debates with the whole board, deliberations with the whole board, and there was also written amendments that came in later. We agreed on a lot of things. For example, we agreed that it was right that Facebook decided to remove Mr. Trump from the platforms. But also, as you could also see from the decision, there was also a minority position. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the minority positions was that we should not only have looked at the 6th and 7th of January post, we should also have gone back to Mr. Trump's earlier post and what he was saying many months before to understand the full case. That was a minority position, but the majority felt that we should keep it quite narrow and look at the 2 posts. that made Facebook take this decision.
In the end, how divided would you say the board was on this final decision?
Well, we are very happy with this decision, and there was a broad majority adopting this position, and the minority positions you can see in the decision, because we're very transparent. What took us a long time was, of course, that we got a point of view from the user, Mr. Trump and his administration. We got a point of view from Facebook, but we also got almost 10,000 what we call public comments for this case. And obviously, we had to be respectful towards that. So that is why the case took a little bit longer, because there were so many individuals and organizations who wanted to talk to us about how they felt we should look at this case.
Some people have used the analogy of ping pong, that you've sent this back to Facebook to make a decision within 6 months. Madam Prime Minister, what's the point of having a Facebook Supreme Court if you're not going to issue the final ruling?
We did issue a final ruling. We did say that Facebook was right to take these posts down and block Mr. Trump. So that is the final ruling. We upheld Facebook's decision, and that is what we're here for. But we also felt, and excuse my language, we felt it was a bit lazy of Facebook to sending over to us a penalty suggestion that didn't exist in their own rule book, so to speak, or in their own community standards. And we are not here to lift responsibility off Facebook. We're here to be independent, to look at Facebook's own rules, to ask whether they are following their own rules and the human rights standards they have said they want to follow. But we're not here to invent new rules for Facebook or take responsibility from Facebook to actually following their own standards. So that is why I wouldn't call this ping pong, but it is true that we have told Facebook that we don't want to take decision on an arbitrary sanction that doesn't exist. We want Facebook to look at this again, look at all the advice we have given Facebook, and we hope they will adopt most of this advice. And with that basis, look at this case again. There's no way that there's an automatic path for Mr. Trump to come back to Facebook and Instagram. There has to be an assessment on whether the content would also in the future pose any risk or any harm. But Facebook now has the option to really look at this and find out what sanction will they give Mr. Trump, and use their own sanction system that applies to everyone else. Why is this user more special than everyone else? What we are arguing for is that all users have the right to free speech. They also can't step over Facebook's community standards, and they also have the right for the sanctions and penalties that Facebook has in place, not new ones that Facebook invents.
Madam Prime Minister, I want to be sure I got your word right. You said lazy was the word you used, right?
Yeah, I did say a little bit lazy, and we didn't think that they should send a verdict to us that was based, that the decision they took, fine, that's what we should be looking at. And we have actually given a very clear decision on that. But what we didn't want is to lift responsibility of Facebook because they have it in their own power to decide which penalties they give to their users. So they can't take one user, and I admit it is a special user, I get that. But what we are saying is that all rules, the same rules should apply to all users, and that's why we didn't want to take a position on this invented penalty that Facebook brought to us. We want to send it back to Facebook to find out which ones of their known penalties and sanctions would they use against this user. But we're also saying it doesn't have to be tomorrow. We will give them time because we certainly do not want another hasty decision.
One option is for Facebook to delete Donald Trump's account. Do you personally think that Facebook should delete Donald Trump's account?
I actually think it would be wrong of me at this stage, where we just came out with this decision to give my personal opinion about this. And I do think this is up to Facebook. And this is all about the oversight board is not here to lift the responsibility of Facebook. That's been one of the criticisms of the oversight board, that now Facebook is just shooting these decisions to another forum. But we are not here to lift Facebook's responsibility. We are here to find out whether they're following their own rules and whether they're doing that in a transparent and clear clear way. So I don't think it would be suitable for me to give my own personal opinion. I'm very, very happy with this decision. But what happens in the future and which sanctions Facebook should give to Mr. Trump, that surely must be up to Facebook itself.
How much contact was there between the board and Facebook, the company?
Not much. We asked them questions and they answered most of those questions. They've given I would say, solid explanation for their decision. And just as a small thing, I think it is interesting that Facebook, just over the few cases we have gone through, have become much clearer and much better in their reasoning for why they take decisions. And I actually see that as an early result of the board's work, that they're becoming much more considerate, much more structured, systematic in the way they give these this reasoning. So this is what they answer questions and they give their reasons, and then from there on, it's only the board that discusses with us with ourselves. We don't involve Facebook in our deliberations.
Madam Prime Minister, did you consider involving or consulting other platforms, for instance, Twitter, Google? Twitter
no,
and YouTube, which of course is part of Google.
No, we don't. And we didn't do in this case. I mean, we have said from the outset, and the bigger purpose with the oversight board is that it can actually, in the future, if some of the other platforms would like to have a similar system with an oversight board, they can learn from our experience, or they can even use this oversight board. But that's down the line, that is in the future. But no, for this case, we decided to look strictly at what had happened on Facebook and Instagram, and on those 2 days that were decisive for Facebook's decision to remove Mr. Trump.
And Madam Prime Minister, while we're talking about the future, while we're looking down the road, how do you see the Facebook Oversight Board in 5 years? And what is the likelihood that you'll have other platforms under your wing at that point?
Well, the latter question, I don't know how to answer this. I mean, we've actually just begun looking at cases, and we are expanding our scope all the time, which is, of course, what we thought we would do all the time, but it's been technically a little bit difficult. So we are growing and expanding our scope, and we're also still in the beginning of our work. But what I'm seeing happening in Facebook, I see a little sign of this already is that there will be much more principled in how they take decision. I think this is the last time Facebook will invent a penalty for a user, as they have done this time, because now we have clearly said that they can't do that. So I do think that every time we take a decision, they learn from it, and they also look at our policy recommendation. And don't forget, after some time has passed, we will look at Facebook and find out, have they done what we've asked them to do in terms of decisions? Have they followed our policy recommendations? And we will also do a transparency report, a full report, where people will be able to discuss and understand how we see how much Facebook has followed our advice and also followed our decisions.
How much consideration did you give to social bias, which is a fancy way of saying that conservatives think you have it out for them, and even more think that after this decision?
I think the best way of combating this social bias that people are talking about, that Facebook leans in a certain direction, is to make sure that all users are equal, and that Facebook uses the same standard, the same transparency, the same clarity for all users. The more we take politics out of this, the better it is. And it's always the case, I think, if you have clear rules, follow those clear rules and are transparent about how you make up your decisions, then the policy bias will simply be there'll be less policy bias, and the discussion will subside as well.
And Madam Prime Minister, as we finish up here, what do you think of the perception that the board has too much power?
Well, I have to ask the question back, who should have this power? I mean, until we were in existence, it was up to Facebook themselves to decide what content stayed up and what content got removed. And ultimately, it was up to Mark Zuckerberg to take these decisions. And I challenge you, of course, is that the good way of doing it? The other part of this is that it could be governments taking these decisions, which is one of the discussions that they have many places. But I'm very, very worried about that, because I can point out to many governments who would love to start deciding what people should post on social media. There are a lot of autocratic governments who would love to be part of that, therefore stifling many, many people's freedom of speech. So this might not be the perfect solution, but it is much better than Facebook doing it himself or a government taking these decisions. We are independent. We're not paid by Facebook. They can't decide which decisions we take, and they have to follow our decisions. So it might not be a perfect setup, but I challenge anyone to come up with a setup that is better for these very difficult content decisions that social media companies are taking every day.
Do you think Facebook will regret setting up the Facebook Oversight Board?
No, I don't think so. A lot of people have asked me that, but I don't think they'll regret it, because I actually think Facebook in the long run, maybe they don't feel that so much today, but in the long run, they will benefit from the clarity and the principled decision-making that we are pushing them into. Because just as an example from this day, I mean, I do think this will be the last day where they make an arbitrary sanction. So they will be pushed into taking more principled and transparent and equal decisions, so that all users are treated as equally. And that's very important to the Oversight Board as well. So I think gradually Facebook will develop clearer and stronger standards. I'm not talking about making them more complex or regulating more, but actually clarifying their own standards. And if you look at our recommendation, they go to the same. One of our recommendations today is that Facebook should be much, much clearer in telling their users why they get a strike, how many strikes they have, why they get removed from the pages, when they can come up again. And I do think that Facebook owe that to their own users, to be much more transparent about which actions they take on their content.
So my friend Taylor is saying, Mike, please wrap up. As we say goodbye at the end of our interviews, we always finish with one fun thing. So Madam Prime Minister, I have to ask you, would you rather have a long conversation with Donald Trump or Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, I have spoken to Mark Zuckerberg, but I've never spoken to Donald Trump. So I think I would perhaps pick him.
What was Mark Zuckerberg like?
I spoke to Mark Zuckerberg. I've spoken to him quite a few times, but of course, when we did this board together, he was very, very keen to get an independent oversight board. And I can tell you that I asked him also, will it be independent? Will you follow our decisions? And none of us in this oversight board would have joined if the answer to that question had not been yes.
And Facebook has stuck to that bargain.
Absolutely. They know what we are. They know exactly why we are here. And I think they think that they will get more order in their own decision making by having a board that looks at this in a much more principled way that they have done until now.
Madam Prime Minister, thank you for joining Axios.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this Axios virtual event. For more information about Sarah Fisher's newsletter, Axios Media Trends, or my newsletters, Axios AM and PM, please check out axios.com/newsletters or the Axios app. And we hope you'll join us in just a few hours, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, for another Axios virtual event. Vitals Live with Representative Lauren Underwood and Stacey Stewart, President and CEO of the March of Dimes. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you on Axios.com.